Hello, friends. For the past few years, I've engaged in endless discussions on the topic of illegal immigration, namely the immigration of Latin American peoples who migrate from their home countries to the U.S., not following the conventional procedures, but oftentimes breaking the law in order to get into this country. In a lot of these discussions, I have engaged with Christians, which is interesting because what I have discovered is that for a lot of my Christian friends, it's really difficult for them to uh, engage this discussion without having to make judgment calls that are really determined by Romans chapter 13 from the Bible, basically. So, Romans chapter 13 states that we should all be subject to the governing authorities and that there is no authority except that which was established by God, and that to rebel against those established authorities, one is in one way or another rebelling against God Himself. And so, when it comes to the issue of illegal immigration, for a lot of my Christian friends who hold dearly to Romans 13, it's very difficult for them not to look at these immigrants from Latin America as criminals because, in their mind, they have broken the nation's law, a nation which God had established, and therefore are also sinning against God. So deportations, arrests, and things like that are justified because people are breaking laws. And so, what I want to do is I want to kind of challenge that a bit and just say, hey, friends, the situation of illegal immigration is a little bit deeper than that. It's much deeper. It's a lot more complex. And I think maybe a helpful framework would be the one that I just kind of scribbled onto this white paper. So, what I did was I drew an iceberg to illustrate kind of the situation. Because I feel like what happens often is my Christian friends sit on this little boat and they examine the situation of illegal immigration, but are only looking at the tip of the iceberg. And they're looking at it from a very narrow lens, which is Romans 13. And so what they see is people illegally crossing the border. Romans 13 says that God establishes laws, right? And so therefore, if people are crossing the border illegally and breaking the law, they are not only criminalizing themselves, but they are also sinning. And I think what I want to do is I want to encourage my friends to think about this a little bit more critically. Understand that maybe what they need to do for a second is jump off of this Romans 13 boat just to look at the situation. And so when you swim a little bit deeper, you start noticing that there are patterns, right? So like patterns like people who really love their country but also love their families and are forsaking all of that to come to a country where they would live maybe for the rest of their lives in displacement, far away from the ones they love. And there are people that are doing that every day, every year, by the thousands. And that is a pattern that we should take into account. And so I think after looking at some patterns like that, we should also ask questions about systems. You swim a little bit deeper and you start discovering systems that contribute to those patterns. What are the economic systems in place in some of those Latin American countries? Right? And how much of those systems have been shaped by U.S. economic policy with those countries, right? And so then you swim a little bit deeper and you start realizing that there's a history there, a history waiting to be discovered by those who are jumping off the boat, right? So there's a history where the U.S. interacts with Latin American countries, creates systems which produce patterns, and those patterns are creating the tip of the iceberg that many of us see. And after you explore all of that, you go a little bit deeper, you start discovering that history and the tragedy that you may find or discover in that history has been shaped by the dominant cultural values of powerful people. And so what I want to do is just to end this, I would give an example of like what I've learned in Guatemala. And so I studied in Guatemala for a little season, and what I discovered was that, you know, talking about patterns, I've recognized that there have, growing up, I've always seen kind of like large, large amounts of people from Central America and especially Guatemala who have been my neighbors. And I've often wondered, like, why is there so many of them in my neighborhood? And when I started studying in Guatemala, I realized that there was systems in place. For example, if you go to my tia's home in Puerto Barrios, which is Guatemala on the Caribbean side, what you'll notice just a few blocks away from her house is that there are large American ships with huge famous logos like Chiquita Banana, and they come to this port city, Puerto Barrios, to collect all of the produce, bananas, papayas, mangoes, and so on. What struck me when I visited her once was the amount of good fruit that went on the ships and the rotting fruit that remained with the people. And so you see little flea markets, people selling rotting fruit. And so it's really sad that the good fruit comes to the US, the bad fruit stays with the poor. And so there are systems in place that have contributed to that. So then when you start looking at the history a little bit, you start discovering that actually there's a huge history of US involvement in places like Guatemala. For example, in the early 1900s, the United Fruit Company, which was a predominantly American company, actually was interested in fruit, basically fruit, right? Producing fruit. And so one of the things that they did was they worked closely with the Guatemalan government to create an industry of fruit in that area. And uh, so what happened, unfortunately, was that a lot of the fertile land was found where a lot of the indigenous people lived. And so when they began to push the indigenous people out, some of them revolted, others partnered with communist guerrillas. But according to the fruit company, everyone was a guerrilla, and so what they did was they appealed to the U.S. government. U.S. government got involved. They began investing in uh, overthrowing a certain Guatemalan government that was a little bit more on the social justice side, and replacing that government with a more kind of a American conservative type or accommodating government, which ended up allowing the United Fruit Company to succeed in their efforts. The name has changed several times, and I think the current name that it now has is Chiquita Banana. And so when you look at the history, you start seeing U.S. involvement in that nation, U.S. military sponsored violence in that country, and that kind of violence created a civil war that ended actually in the early 1990s. What's sad is that the war cultivated or engendered a culture of violence that continues to exist. It's now being manifest through a lot of the gangs that exist in Guatemala. And so there is a history that has created certain systems that continue to create the patterns of migration that that cause people to come to the U.S. And I would say a lot of that history has been shaped by the greed of dominant peoples. And it is their values, precisely their values, that have shaped the outcome of this all. And so when you look at the situation again and you start thinking about the migration of people, right, from Latin America, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, Mexico, when you start looking at why people migrate, it's not because they just decided that one day they want to get off their couch and go and migrate. People love their land, people love their families, but there are things that this country has done to create patterns of migration, and I don't think it's fair, to be honest with you, that this small little verse be the last word on why people are illegally crossing the border. So the question that I would end with is, who's breaking whose law, right? Who's breaking whose law? Is it the poor immigrant who is just trying to escape the pattern of violence that exists in their home country, or the poverty poverty and violence that has been namely created by the U.S., right? Are they the ones breaking the law by crossing the border, or is it the powerful in this nation who are creating those systems and those patterns of violence and poverty, the ones who are breaking God's law? So who's breaking God's law? Is it the immigrant, or is it the powerful elite who determine some of these policies? And so I hope this helps. I hope you can think a little bit deeper. Surely in 10 minutes, I did not answer all your questions, but maybe, just maybe, this framework will help you think a little bit more critically. Thank you very much.